remember another incident which was very interesting in Cuba, when together with Fidel, in the big hall of the Carlos Marx theater, they announced the miracle operation, this initiative taken by Venezuela and Cuba to cure the eyes of people, of the poor people. About 10 million people in Latin America are suffering of eyes and have no access to cure. So they decided to make a campaign with the medical technology of Cuba and the financial means of Venezuela to help the people to have access to the cure of the eyes, which was a very, very interesting initiative, because I've seen people who had been cured. When you have people who said, well, I could not see and now I can see, it is something quite important humanly. And they called the operation miracle. Well, that was a biblical reference, of course, because the people who cannot see will see. So they were announcing that publicly, and they were joking to each other, Fidel and Chavez, and I remember it was a little after the incident where Fidel fell and broke his leg, and so Chavez was saying to Fidel, you have fallen, but that was planned, because you have a security service which is following you centimeter by centimeter, and you fall. That was planned, of course. And Fidel said, well, when you fought with the military coup, of course, just a few years before, that was also planned. So they were joking. And at what moment, Chavez was explaining the new campaign to cure the eyes, and then he took again his small cross, and he said, well, the reference, one of the references is there. And so at one moment, he turned to Fidel, and he said to Fidel, I give you my cross. Fidel did not expect that for a few seconds, and Fidel said, I accept. And he took the cross from Chavez. So that was interesting. They were interesting small things, but which I think were indicating the way that he was situating himself from the religious point of view, which was quite simple, but I think quite sincere also, and so. Yes, the other time that he asked me to go to the Hello Presidente was a moment that in the press there was the announcement of the discovery of one heterodox gospel in the history. There was been the Gospel of Saint Judas, I think, also, I don't know. Of course, there exist several of Saint Thomas, etc., and they are interesting historical documents. They are not recognized as Orthodox, the four Gospels, which are recognized, and then there are a few others which are non-Orthodox, and which generally are also full of quite extraordinary stories and things like that. Well, anyway, so then he asked me, "What do you think about this discovery?" So of course I did not know, because I did not know the document, and I did not know the history of this document. So I answer saying, well, I don't know. We have to treat that as an historical document and try to use the historical methods, linguistic methods, etc., to try to know what is the value of such a document. But so that was, I remember that he asked me my opinion on that, and I could not give really an answer. Well, yeah, so I think that on a more fundamental issue, from the political and social point of view, I think that the orientation of Chavez, if we compare that with some others, has been probably with more preoccupation of building a popular strength, a popular movement. Of course, because the popular movement had been practically washed away by the preceding political systems. There was no, the power, the progressive power in Venezuela did not come out of the action of popular movements. No, it came from the military, it's true, but military who had a certain vision of society. So he was preoccupied by building a more popular movement. Probably more than Lula and than Evo Morales and some others who came out of the popular movement. So they did not have to build it. But that was a very fundamental preoccupation. And the second aspect of Chavez, especially at the end of his life, was ecology, was the environment. And so he began to speak about eco-socialism. And that was very important for him. I remember that the last time I went to Venezuela, Chavez time, I was asked to make a seminar in Caracas with the guardians of the public gardens of Caracas during a day about eco-socialism. Of course, those people, were about 100, participated to that seminar. Those people were very sensitive to the natural, to nature, and to the care of nature. But of course, to make the link between that and socialism is something different. So the whole problem was how to make the link between this respect of nature and the socialist organization of society. So we had a seminar on that. That was interesting because it showed the preoccupation of Chavez, first popular. So he was concerned by the fact that the guardians of the public parks of Caracas would also have a social consciousness, you know. And second, to make the link between care of nature and socialist organization. So that was very interesting in this sense. He had no time to go much further in that because, of course, he died. But he was also, he asked, for example, to make a very interesting experiment in one of the provinces, I don't remember the name of the province, where the soil of agricultural land was extremely contaminated, and I had a meeting with the agronomists who were working there, and they told me the soil is so contaminated that before doing anything new in organic production, we have first to clean the soil, and that takes several years. and they explained me all the techniques they were using to clean the soil, because it was such a state that you could not begin the work on the soil. So there was a whole operation to clean the soil, the agricultural soil of a certain region, and that was also one of the preoccupations of Chavez.
So, what do you think are some of the main legacies? We are seeing a change in the regime, in the government, but then, for example, the popular networks, the work he has done in the slums. So what could you say? What would be some of the main legacies?
Well, first of all, in spite of the great political difficulties that the present-day government has in Venezuela, Maduro, there are still 40% of the people who are expressly Chavez, in favor of Chavez, and voting for Maduro because he is in the continuity of Chavez. So there is a certain solid base that has not disappeared. Of course, it is no more the majority. That is a fact. That is the first thing that we have to keep in mind. It is not the end of the thinking and the action of Chavez. The second thing is that, of course, the possibility that Chavez had to begin a new policy internally, Latin American and also world, has been possible because of the petroleum rent. The petroleum, how do you call that, the rent or the
revenue?
Revenue, yes, the revenue of petroleum. As a matter of fact, 97% of the export of Venezuela comes from petroleum. So when Chavez began its the change, of course, we were in an international positive conjuncture at that time for the price of commodities. So the price of petroleum was high and became higher. So it has been possible for Chavez to organize like a parallel state. He could not use the state as the instrument to transform society, because the state, as a matter of fact, was in the hand of very conservative civil servants. I remember that more than 2/3 of the diplomatic representative outside in the whole world were of the opposition when Chavez was in power. So you cannot use that kind of state to transform society. So what did he do? He organized like a parallel state with the missions. The missions for primary school, the mission for secondary school, for higher education. That means to help people from the bottom, from the lower class of society, to have access to those new public services. Same thing for health, same thing for land reform, same thing for indigenous policies, etc. All kind of missions. And practically they were ministries. Not official state ministries, but missions paid by the petroleum revenue. But then, when you have a situation where at once, in a few months, the price of petroleum is going down, not 100%, but 500%, you are facing just an impossible situation. You know? True enough, Chavez was able to recuperate the state little by little, and to have a state more at the service of the social project. But anyway, the greatest deal of all the social project of Chavez was paid by petroleum revenue. And of course, Chavez was quite aware of the weakness of that problem, of that situation. And he tried to transform the economy, because the economy was still, and is still, in the hand of the capitalist system. Not to speak about the international situation, because a great deal of petroleum exploitation is in the hand of multinationals, because Venezuela was not able to transform all its apparatus, even of petroleum production, in a national one at once. And so he was preoccupied by more national production, because since more than 50 years, because of the revenue of petroleum, all the other activities have been marginalized. Agriculture, for example. 70% of the food is coming from outside. Because the people working in agriculture, or the rich people, they all went to petroleum, or the peasants went to the cities, and agriculture was abandoned. And to a certain extent, the only peasant there, not completely, but the majority, are the Colombian refugees. 4 million Colombian refugees. Most of them are the peasants. So, what to do with that kind of situation? So he was not able to transform the structure, productive structure of the country, in order to have more local production and, of course, to depend less from the price of petroleum. And that's why when Maduro had to face the crisis of petroleum, he has been lost. He has been lost, because what to do? Without any means to continue the policy. And then you have more and more discontent among the people. And of course you have more and more use of the discontent by the right in order to recuperate the political power. And of course they have made some mistakes, and of course the destruction of the social reality of Venezuela by the revenue of petroleum had not only economic consequences, but also social and cultural, so that the consuming ideology is more developed than in any other part of Latin America, and corruption. And corruption is part of the political culture, and Chavez was not able to eliminate that in its own organization. And that is the situation for the moment. Yeah.
So, can we talk about Evo Morales?
Ah, yes. Well, I will begin with the first meeting I had with Evo. Was a few years ago, when we had a research project on autonomy of the indigenous peoples in Latin America. What was an initiative of Leo Gabriel, anthropologist from Austria, with 4 different centers in Europe. One was CETRI, the Tricontinental Center of Louvain-la-Neuve, and 6 different centers in Latin America. from Mexico, of course with the Zapatistas, to Bolivia. And we had to divide the work a little bit, of course, during the whole research, which was financed by the European Community. And I happened to have to go for the supervision of the research work in Panama and in Bolivia. Of course, I went also to Nicaragua and to Ecuador, but for other reasons. And so in Bolivia, we had chosen Chapare, which is a region of Bolivia near Cochabamba, and precisely the region where Evo was the local leader. So I went there, spent a few days, and I went to visit also the different communities. And there were communities coming from the mountains of Bolivia, but going to the plains. And I remember I was quite impressed by the fact that many, especially of the women, were still wearing the vestment of the mountains where it is cold. There in the plains where it is very hot, you know, and how those poor women were able to continue to dress themselves in the traditional way, but with very heavy clothing in a very hot climate. So there had been a migration from the mountain to the plains. And in the mountains, the Indian people, indigenous people, were mostly miners because the mines were in the mountains. And so their organization, their social organization, was called trade union. And they had trade unions. But when they came to the plains and organized themselves with other kind of activities, they did not call themselves villages or communities, they still called themselves trade unions. So you had the trade unions there in the plains for people working in agriculture and communities which were called trade unions. It was an interesting social phenomenon. So when I came there with a sociologist from Cochabamba, who was called Coca, and he became the minister of presidency of Evo Morales afterwards, when Evo came to power. But he accompanied me because he was in charge of the research work in this project. So we spent a few days in Chapare. And in Chapare, it was just the time that Evo Morales was organizing the Olympic Games of Chapare. And that was the games between the different schools. For football and basketball and etc. And he was the organizer of all this. And he was playing as arbiter in the different games. So he was busy, quite busy those days. So to facilitate my visit, he gave me his car. So during 2 or 3 days, I traveled in the whole region with the car of Evo, because he was busy with the organization of the games. So I saw that was an interesting thing to see him as the local leader. How was he? You really organized the people, the different communities, the different trade unions, and which because their name was still trade unions, you know. So that was for me a whole discovery of many aspects. First, of how indigenous communities stick together. What is the how a local leader can help also to not just to remain on traditional things, but also to initiate new things, new initiatives, like the games between the different schools, and also this strange, I would say almost linguistic problem of adopting the names of an industrial society or a mining society to a new rural society, but without problems, because for the people it was quite normal. Anyway, I discovered there also the problem of the drug traffic, because the production of coca, not only for the use of the people normally, but for international traffic was also a reality there. And quite a few people spoke me about that problem also. So that was a first contact, to see Evo as a local leader. The second time I had contact with him was in Brasilia, precisely for the inauguration of Lula in the year 2004, if I remember well. And we were together in the same hotel, and then we went together for the ceremony. And I happened to know quite well also Fernando Henrique Cardoso, the former president, who became neoliberal, but was one of the great men of the theory of dependency, which had been one of the bases for the thinking of the liberation theology. So a Marxist-oriented thinking at that time. So when I knew Cardoso, it was during the time of dictatorship in Brazil, and when I went several times to Sao Paulo, and I was received by Cardoso, who is a sociologist, and so I knew him very, very, very well. And then I assisted to the time that Cardoso gave the signs of the presidency to Lula. And at that time I was just near to Evo. And I said to Evo, in 4 years from now, in Bolivia, you will receive that in Bolivia. So he laughed, of course, but true enough, 4 years after that, he was elected as the president, you know. So those are small stories. But then, of course, I went several times back to Bolivia, and also I met Evo in different places of the world, in the World Social Forum, where I several times explained the whole situation of Bolivia and the struggle of the indigenous people. I met him also in Cuba. I met him in Europe also. So we had several meetings. And in Bolivia, I had the opportunity to be with him at several occasions. One occasion was in Cochabamba, when there was a meeting of the Red of Intellectuals, and he came, and I had to speak in the name of the Red to him, and I remember that I chose the whole problem of indigenous culture, how to express new values in the indigenous culture. And later on, when we went to La Paz, that was in Cochabamba, I had a conversation with him about the problem of the access to the sea of Bolivia, because we had organized in CETRI and then in the University of Louvain an international meeting on the access of Bolivia to the sea. At that time, I was the chairman of the Solidarity Committee of Belgium with Bolivia. And so we had invited, the university invited, 4 intellectuals from Chile, 4 from Peru, and 4 from Bolivia to discuss together the problem of access of Bolivia to the sea and try to come some kind of proposal of solution. And we met in Louvain for 1 week. And so there had been a document which has been called Document of Lorraine with a proposal agreed by the 12 intellectuals from the 3 countries. And so, of course, Evo knew that very well. And so he was very interested by the conclusions of this group. And we had a discussion together about that. After that, they decided to go to The Hague, you know. And well, one of the documents for the decision of the Hague court is the document of Louvain. The origin was in CETRI. But later on, I had some contacts with him for different occasions. One was I was invited to the Summit of the Earth in 2010. And I remember that at one moment he invited a few people to be at the lunch at the table of the presidency. And strange enough, there was Fray Beto, the Dominican from Brazil, who had made this interview on Fidel and religion. There was Leonardo Boff, the theologian liberation. There was Miguel de Escoto, the Nicaraguan former Minister of Foreign Affairs, but who was a priest also, that I knew since many, many years when he was working in Chile. And then myself, and also the Vice President of Cuba. So then, when Evo took the floor at the end of the dinner, he spoke, and he said, "Well, look at this table." He said, "Only the Vice President of Cuba and myself are not members of the church here." Because all the others were people coming from the church, of course, in the line of liberation theology and etc. So, and that was interesting.